G'day viewers! Today we're going to talk about bits, bytes and cupcakes.
So our topic, distributed denial of service, is interesting to us because it's actually an attack on network availability. So this is really very different than many of the different kinds of security problems we've seen before, where we could provide confidentiality, integrity and authenticity to secure messaging in some way. Distributed denial of service has none of those aspects. It's simply about sending packets. So all of these cryptographic protections, they don't help us at all. That makes it interesting for you to see just as a contrast for a different kind of security problem. And it's also kind of cool just to learn about some of the various difficulties we face in the internet today and the nasty things that go on. Okay, so let me start with a little bit of motivation. You've seen this before. The best part of IP connectivity, you can send to any other host. The worst part of IP connectivity, any other host can send to you. And other hosts who you don't know or don't like can send lots of nasty stuff to you. In fact, if there are many of them, as there are here, Trudy has really become an army of Trudies, if you like. Trudy, or the army of Trudies, can flood a target host by simply sending packets to it across the network. If you send enough packets, this interferes with IP connectivity. And the host may then become unresponsive because all of the resources in the network and at the host are consumed by this flood of packets. That's going to leave no resources left over for the server or the host over here to interact with whoever it really wanted to interact with. And this is this is called denial of service. Actually, denial of service is a more general term. This is one example, one form of denial of service. Okay, so let's just talk about the goal and threat model to be clear what it is we're trying to accomplish. Now, the goal is simply for a host to be able to maintain network connectivity for it to use for all of the desired services it's providing. Typically, this will be a server talking to its other clients on the internet, its intended users. Great, so they should just be able to talk. And we would like to, in the ideal case, you see I have this line, we've separated Trudy out so that she can't interfere with this exchange. The threat is that Trudy may somehow overwhelm the host with undesired traffic, simply by sending packets actually, that's all she'll have to do, and that this will interfere with using the normal services of the network. Now, about now is where things go a little south, and I tell you the state of distributed denial of service in the internet today. Actually, it's a huge problem today. Just one relatively recent example is that there have been many attacks on US banks, which are distributed denial of service attacks, in which traffic purportedly from Iran has been targeted at US banks in retaliation for other things, and has flooded all of these bank servers and made them very difficult to use. Akamai, who monitors the state of the internet, in their third quarter of 2012 report, they described that DDoS attacks were on the increase and that actually against the US banks they peaked at 65 gigabits per second of traffic flooding the banks. That is a lot of attack traffic, and you can imagine that could be very hard to deal with, and it could overload pretty much any server you could come up with. Wow, so that's kind of nasty that anyone can just send packets and overwhelm other internet hosts. Now, the thing that's a little unfortunate in the internet reality check for us is that unlike many of these other security problems we've looked at, there really are no great solutions to this problem in the internet today. There are certainly things that can help using CDNs and filtering traffic and all of those things. I'm going to mention them briefly. But because denial of service at its heart comes from simply sending many packets, and that's what the internet does, it's really quite difficult to defend against it. That makes it an interesting but also a very challenging problem. So let's go on and just have a little bit of fun and learn what distributed denial of service is all about. So first of all, starting with denial of service. Denial of service really simply means that service is denied. So a system is made unavailable to its intended users. And typically, the way you'll accomplish this, because we're not really usually talking about bugs in the system that can compromise the host, typically the way you will accomplish this is to simply consume all of the resources of the system. Attackers, if they consume all of the usable resources of the system, there'll be none left over for the intended users, and they'll see a system that's unresponsive, doesn't really work. Now, denial of service could be talked about in many different contexts in computer systems. In the network context, what I'm really going to be talking about when we talk about a system, we really usually mean a server, something that's on the internet to provide a service. It could be just your host tool at home, and you could be unlucky enough to receive a flood of traffic. But we're usually talking about a server that's there to allow legitimate clients to use it. Resources mean a couple of different things. They might mean network bandwidth, if we're talking about the network resources, or if we're talking about host resources at the server, just its CPU, its memory, and things like that. If we just focus on the host for a while, denial of service at a host can be accomplished simply by sending strange packets to the host that totally zap its resources and deplete them. Here are a couple of examples. Now, there used to be, well, there still are, packets called ping of death, malformed packets. You could send this ping packet to a host, and it was constructed in such a way that it would trigger a kernel bug and crash your system. So you'd send one packet and you would take down a host. That's why it was the ping of death. If you got it, you died. That would be one example causing host denial of service. Another example is a SYN flood, where an attacker sends many TCP connection requests, that is TCP SYN packets, to a host. The host will respond by sending SYNACK packets and doing all of the usual things to open a connection, including setting aside resources in the kernel for connection structures. But what would happen if the attacker simply sent many SYNs, flooded SYNs, but never ever bothered following up with in response to the SYNACKs? Pretty soon you would fill up all of the connection structures at the host, and it would be unable to accept new connections. This is called a SYN flood. This used to work in the old days. So you can see here the idea is that a relatively small number of bad packets can deplete the host resources. It's either its CPU or its memory or other resources on the host. And this is host denial of service. Now, I'm actually not really going to focus on that. These strange packets are really having nasty effects on the host. You can often patch all of the specific vulnerabilities that are identified. Patches for pings of death have been around for a long time and would be deployed on most servers that you would care about, so you can no longer take them down. There are many different kinds of vulnerabilities, so a best practice when you run a server to keep it robust is to always apply these different patches for new vulnerabilities as new vulnerabilities are discovered. If you're interested, you could read about SYN cookies as a defense against SYN floods. That's a pretty interesting one because it is a little bit of a protocol design. But for host denial of service, we're not going to focus on it much because you can defend against it mostly by keeping your host up to date. So let's move to network denial of service. The resource which is going to be exhausted here is the network. It's simply bandwidth. So the nasty fact here is that you can cause network denial of service simply by sending enough packets to saturate the network. Doesn't matter what they are. If you can just send many packets, then you'll be able to saturate the network links. If you do, and here's a picture of it, you can see this access link here is leading up to a server or a host at the other end. This pipe, this access link in the middle here, it's full of bad packets, nasty packets from Trudy. If Trudy sends enough packets, then as the traffic approaches this access link, there will tend to be congestion and loss in the routers that lead up to the access link. And packets from your intended user here, you can see there's one pink packet here, we'll see very high congestion and loss. Most of them won't get through, and the server won't be able to respond and have a reasonable conversation with them. So this is what happens with network denial of service, where the attack is on the network bandwidth. That's the bandwidth inside this link that's leading up to the server. As you might imagine here, if you want to undertake this kind of attack, you're going to want to send a lot of packets. So it's helpful here to have many different attackers. And when you have many different attackers, and they're going to be at different places on the network, this denial of service is called distributed denial of service. There are many distributed attackers, all of whom have it in for you. In fact, it looks somewhat like this. As you can imagine, an effective way to provide distributed denial of service attacks is with a botnet. A botnet is a large network of compromised hosts. So if there really are nasty people out there who have compromised various machines. Your home machine could be one of them, you might not even know. And having compromised those machines, they can then use them as a source of attack traffic. There are believed to be botnets that that have many thousands of compromised hosts, maybe hundreds of thousands of compromised hosts. If whoever is running that botnet decides to use them all in concert to send packets to you, you'll receive an awful lot of packets. So you can see here, just all of the different hosts in the botnet. If they simply flood traffic towards the victim, now I've changed terminology to call this server the victim because that's what it is, then the network will increasingly saturate as you get closer to the victim because there's only a certain amount of network capacity that leads up to the victim. Typically the access link will be the most restricted link leading up to the victim. That's why I showed it in the previous slide. And we'll saturate that link, causing congestion and loss, and it's over. Actually, it's even worse than I've said so far. Because when the attackers send packets, they might also be able to falsify their IP addresses. How do you do that? Well, you simply put a fake source address, IP source address, on your packet. Historically, the network doesn't check IP source addresses. They're used by the destination to be able to send a packet back to you. But in this case, we're not using that functionality, so a source might be able to put any old identification there. If you do that, you're hiding your location. You're hiding the location of the attackers. It makes it more difficult for the network, the people who run the network, to track down what's going on. This is called IP address spoofing. And so you can see here Trudy's sending packets, and Trudy simply changes the IP source address to say it's from Bob. Alice then, thinks Bob really has it in for her, even though it's actually Trudy. Okay, so this is definitely can be a complication. Actually, it's even worse than that. Here's an example of nasty things you can do with address spoofing. Look at this trick. Trudy can actually trick Bob into actually sending a packet to Alice. So, in which case, it's really Bob who has been tricked into attacking Alice. If Trudy sends packets to many, many, many different Bobs, if they each send a trickle of traffic to Alice, it will add up to a flood. So to do this, Trudy would send a packet to Bob, and so here's Trudy sending a packet that's to Bob, but the key bit is that Trudy spoofs the source address and says this packet's coming from Alice. It just has to be some kind of packet that will elicit a reply from Bob. If you pinged Bob, maybe Bob would return a ping reply, for instance. If Bob was a DNS server, maybe Bob would return a DNS reply in response to a query. But Bob's reply is shown here. It's this packet here. Well, this is going to be from Bob, of course. Where's it going to be sent? It's going to be sent to the source address, and that was listed as Alice. So Bob will send a packet to Alice. Alice may not be sure what these packets are all about because they're a reply to a query she never sent. So she might not be sure what's going on. But simply by sending them, they may accomplish their goal by clogging up the network close to Alice. So you can see this is pretty nasty. This is an example of some of the nasty things that can go on with attacks. Well, with best practices in the internet today, we can disable most of these kinds of attacks. Now, in fact, there is a specific best practice called ingress filtering. And the idea here is to validate the source address of a packet at the network boundary. So that's like when it enters the ISP, when it goes into the internet at large. This might just seem like common sense, actually. You just make sure that it's okay so that people from the edge of the network can't attack. If you like, you could say that in the internet today, it's the responsibility of the end host that makes the packet to check that the source address is okay. Well, if that host is compromised, that may be a little comfort. So here we would have the ISP check the source address of the packet. This is actually not too hard to do. Here is the ISP boundary. Now, when packets come in, this router can look at where they come from. It says here they come from Bob. And then this router can look up where it would forward packets if packets were being sent back to Bob. Well, the answer should be that they're sent back in the same direction. For instance, if they said from Trudy, if we looked up Trudy, we would send back to Trudy. So we would be pretty confident that they really came from the right place. If we look at Bob though, if this ISP router looks at Bob, Bob will be somewhere different. He won't be at this end of the access link. Only Trudy is. So this router will be able to work out that these packets don't come from Bob. They come from someone else like Trudy, and so the router can simply discard them. And they won't get onto the internet, and so they won't be able to attack Alice, who's a long way away. This is the best practice. However, deployment of this idea has been relatively slow, partly due to incentives. As an ISP, I have to do extra work here to make sure all of these checks are okay and that they don't mess up anything. And this extra work is really to help hosts somewhere a long way away on the internet, hosts who actually aren't paying me money and might not be on my network at all. So it's something extra to do that doesn't directly benefit yourself. Somewhat like vaccines, I guess, it benefits everyone if everyone does it. So we're getting there, but it's taken a while. Okay, so imagine, however, that ingress filtering has been deployed and we take all of these measures. We're back to a basic flood. So the best we can do with a lot of the protections today is render a distributed denial of service attack a simple flood of packets. That can still take us down, especially if it's 65 gigabits per second. What can we do? Not much. I've listed 2 possible flooding defenses here, both of which are used in practice, both of which help. The first one is to increase the network capacity around the server. We said we were going to fill up those access links and clog them. If we can make those access links bigger, they'll be harder for an attacker to clog. And a particular approach which is used here a lot, if you're a high-end internet service and you want to stay up, is to use a CDN. A CDN is really replicating the server at many different locations, so we'll be getting a higher access link bandwidth across all of those locations. We're really summing it together. And it's actually quite clever to use the CDN to do this because we're getting some statistical multiplexing effects amongst the customers of the CDN. To survive a distributed denial of service attack, we want our CDN to provide us with a high peak capacity. And so a CDN should have lots of bandwidth. But realize that not everyone is going to be subject to a distributed denial of service attack at the same time. So we can use the bandwidth of the CDN to protect whoever is under attack right now. Okay, and the second approach, and this is what we really want to do to deal with the DDoS flood, is to filter out the attack traffic within the network. This means at the routers within the network. And really here, the earlier the filtering is done, the closer to the source and the further away from the victim, the better. Because there's more capacity in the network, it won't be clogged up yet. So this is really what we need to do to deal with distributed denial of service attacks today. It's ultimately what's needed. It's somewhat done today, but the measures are employed by ISPs in a fairly ad hoc way. You might need to call up your ISP, for instance, so that they can find out what's going on, and it's not really automated. So now you know the state of denial of service, distributed denial of service. It's a topic on which we would expect to make some progress towards solutions in the future. Okay, hope that was fun.